there, and welcome back for another lesson in APUS history. Today we are going to be discussing topic 4.6, which is our second lesson on the market revolution. Today we're going to be talking about how the market revolution affected society and culture. So the learning objective is to explain how and why innovation in technology, agriculture, and commerce affected various segments of American society over time. So let's take a look at the key concepts. What we're first going to be looking at is how many Americans are shifting from semi-subsistence agriculture, and we're going to be looking at the growth of manufacturing. So these are going to connect really closely to our last lesson, but we're going to connect it to ideas of class conflict, of labor struggles. We're going to connect it to gender and family roles, and then we're also going to talk about how it impacted migration, both outside of the country and within the country. So as we look at this information and as we looked at the key concepts, it's important to note that we are primarily talking about white Americans at this time. So when we look at how the market revolution impacted African Americans, we're going to be discussing that in a couple other lessons later in the unit. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this outline, is that these are going to be taught, that this information is primarily going to be affecting not just white Americans, but mostly middle and upper class. So remember, this is the time that we call the era of good feelings, that many historians describe this general spirit of nationalism and pride and unity within the nation. We also see, connecting to this idea, you need to know the American system, which were these federal policies that increased the Industrial Revolution and fueled the market revolution. When we talk about the market revolution, we're talking about changes in the economic system. And many of these changes were caused by the transportation revolution, many inventions and innovations, the growth of industry, and also the shift, like I mentioned earlier, from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture. So here is an example of women carding and spinning in the home while the man in the family weaves. This could have been a typical home scene before the Industrial Revolution. So when we look at the way that the market revolution is affecting the economy, I think of this image. I think that we see primarily home producers being turned into laborers for another person, laborers in a factory. So we see manufacturing changes. We see the emergence of factories and mills, like I already mentioned. And in our last lesson, we talked about the Lowell mills. We see the emergence of the assembly line, interchangeable parts and machines, significantly impacting the way that factories and mills ran. And so what we also see happening at this time is a shift from custom-made products to standardized products. All of these things are going to cause labor shifts. And that's really the significant part of this lesson, is how do these economic changes then impact people? And so we see demand for labor increase, and the specific type of labor that is being demanded is low wage and unskilled workers. So what we see happening is that prior to this, there would have been many apprentices working for artisans, and they would become extremely skilled in custom products. They would become skilled in making the entire they would become skilled in the entire process of creating a product. But now with the implementation of the assembly line and in factories, you are a worker is just responsible for one aspect of the process. And so they don't need to be highly skilled. Instead, they are low skilled, which means they can be paid low wages and they are easily replaceable. This does lead to rapid migration to cities. And so this is now going to lead into our migration segment of the lesson. Now, although the period 4 ends in 1848, a lot of the immigration information that I'm going to give you goes all the way to 1860. And this lesson, there's components that are also discussed in period 5. So really what we want to become familiar with is who is coming. And the two primary groups that are coming that make the most impact in the market revolution are going to be the Irish and the Germans. So we see significant migration of Irish and Germans to the country in this period of 40 years for economic and political reasons primarily. primarily, but they are very different groups. The Irish are going to be primarily coming and living in northeast urban areas and working as unskilled laborers in factories and mills, whereas Germans are going to be more likely to live in rural areas as farmers, as tradesmen. They are going to be settling more in the Old Northwest and the Western areas. And so this is going to alter the landscape of the nation significantly. Now, besides just international migration, we have internal migration as well. You can see that between 1800 and 1860, we have quite a few new states past the Alleghenies that are joining the nation. There are other states as well, but these are the ones that are going to be primarily rural and agriculturally based societies. Approximately a third of the population is going to live in the area called the Louisiana Purchase prior to, or in 1803. We also see urban growth rapidly increasing, but keep in mind it still is only 20% of the population. So sometimes students get a little mixed up and they think, oh, a huge amount of the population is moving to industrial cities. We are an industrial nation now. That is not true. That shift doesn't actually happen until the 1920s, where we have more people living in urban centers than rural communities. So the majority of Americans are still living in rural America and participating in agriculture. Here's your population growth from 1800 to 1861, massive and rapid increase, especially past 1830. So how does this affect the market revolution? Well, this image does a really good job of showing that. You can see that there are a variety of people that are participating in New England factory life. You can see that there are young women, there are children, there are what looks to be immigrants, there is poor people, and what we see happening is a real shift in the labor and the types of workers that are working in the factories. So we see of these workers that there becomes a growing gap between the wealthy and the poor. So while there is an increase in wages and most people have a greater standard of living, the separation between the wealthy and the poor grows significantly in this time. And one reason for that is going to be what's called the free labor ideology. And this is that capitalism is good because everyone has an equal opportunity to rise. And so is this idea that anyone has the opportunity to go from being poor to becoming a millionaire. And while that was rare, there were enough examples of that where people believed it was true. And so many Northerners are going to defend factory labor as a better system than slavery because people are laboring they are getting wages and they are choosing to labor. So this will be discussed in more units, the difference between wage labor in the North and slave labor in the South. We also see at this time the beginnings of a middle class. And so we see different groups of people that are no longer going to be wage laborers, but they are not the wealthy, massive business owners. And so we have kind of this middle class of people that may own their own companies or may manage under other workers, but they aren't the elite. And so what we see happening in this time period is a growth of class conflict. The differences between the classes become more apparent, and that leads to conflict. Additionally, we see the development of labor unions, and there was a victory for unions, specifically in Massachusetts, in a court case that determined that unions could negotiate labor contracts. And so while labor unions is just in the beginnings in this time period, we see this growth significantly increase in the second half of the 19th century. We do see the emergence of strikes. However, they are not as effective in this time period because we see so many economic dips that it's difficult for people to maintain a strike in that type of economic environment. We do see some states starting to pass some legislation related to working conditions and child labor. So one famous strike that happens in this time period is in the Lowell mills in the 1830s. And here's a quote that the mill girls sang as they were on strike. They said, "Oh, isn't it a pity such a pretty girl as I should be sent to the factory to pine away and die? Oh, I cannot be a slave, I will not be a slave, for I am so fond of liberty that I cannot be a slave." So, as I mentioned earlier, kind of that connection, that comparison between wage labor in the North and enslavement in the South. All right, last major concept here is going to be gender and family roles. And so we see the shift away from the home. Work in the home begins to shift. And so while the female legal status does primarily remain unchanged, we see some increased rhetoric and around ideologies about the proper role for women. And so this philosophy of separate spheres becomes even more integrated for middle and upper class women, because really the only ability or the only groups that had the ability to adhere to these standards would have been those who did not have to have their women labor in factories. And so women were in the world of consumers and domestic life, and men were part of the political and economic production. And this fueled the idea of the cult of domesticity, which is also known as the cult of true womanhood, that women were the moral leaders, and there was a code that basically governed how they were supposed to behave according to purity and submissiveness. And so we see lots of publications, books, magazines, newspapers that re-emphasize the proper sphere of the woman. So while these are traditional stereotypes and reinforcing those gender roles, we do see shifts in the behavior of women because they are shifting from being primarily producers to consumers. So before the market revolution, women would have been responsible for producing a significant amount of the materials for the home. For example, textiles, clothing. But now that the market revolution has created factories that can do that, they are now purchasing these items for the home rather than producing them. So we do see a change in their economic role a bit in this time period. We see that these values of the cult of domesticity ends up affecting middle and upper class children as well. And so an innocent and protected childhood was a privilege that wealthy and middle class families tried to give to their children. We see gender-based schooling. So boys were prepared for additional training, for college, for apprenticeships, for roles in the business and economic world. Whereas girls' schooling opportunities were primarily focused on domestic roles, drawing, cooking, social etiquette, those types of things. Many children also engaged in self-improving activities like reading and playing the piano. And because children in middle-class families no longer needed to contribute economically, we see parents taking a larger role in their education and in their moral development. And so they began to limit the number of children in the family. Now, it is important to note that poor children were still often employed or even indentured and forced to work in another area of the country. So we're going to move to some primary sources here. Here's an image of two types of clothing, a child's shirt in the 1920s compared to a child's shirt in the 1940s. Now, besides just the difference in appearance, there's a significant difference in how these were produced. So in the 1820s, as I mentioned, most of the time women were producers in the family. And so the family grew the cotton, they homespun the cotton, and then they cut it, they sewed it, and the shirt would have been worn by males and females and reworn many times over. In the 1840s, we see the development of those transportation networks, we see the development of the mills, and so it goes from being cotton grown in the South by enslaved Africans, sometimes then transported to England or the Northeast. And then we see those it being turned into fabric, which then the woman of the family can purchase and then turn into an item to be worn by the family. Here is a quote about the difference in this transition. The transition from homespun to factory-made clothing is already so far made that the very terms domestic manufacture have quite lost their meaning, being applied to that which is neither domestic as being made in the house nor manufacture as being made by the hands. This transition is a great one one that is to carry with it a complete revolution of domestic life and social manners. So, significant changes to the life of the woman, especially as a result of the market revolution. Continuing on that idea, how did this affect the spheres of women? This is from the Ladies' Repository. Where lieth woman's sphere? Not there, where strife and fierce contentions are, not in the wild and angry crowd, mid threatenings high and clamors loud, nor in the halls of rude debate and legislation is her seat. What then is woman's sphere? The sweet and quiet precincts of her home, home where the blessed affections meet, where strife and hatred may not come. Home, sweetest word in the mother's tongue, long since in verse undying song. And Alexis de Tocqueville was a European who was observing life in America, and he wrote this excerpt about understanding equality of the sexes. And he says, the Americans have applied to the sexes the great principle of political economy which governs the manufactures of our age, by carefully dividing the duties of man from those of woman in order that the great work of society may be better carried on. Thus, the Americans do not think that man and woman have either the duty or the right to perform the same offices, but they show an equal regard for both their respective parts, and though their lot is different, they consider both of them as beings of equal value. As for myself, I do not hesitate to avow that although the women of the United States are confined within the narrow circle of domestic life, and their situation is in some respects one of extreme dependence, I have nowhere seen women occupying a loftier position. And if I were asked, now that I am drawing to a close of this work, in which I have spoken of so many important things done by the Americans, to what the single prosperity and growing strength of that people ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply, to the superiority of their women. So, really interesting take here on separate spheres and the importance of that. So, I hope that this lesson was really helpful for understanding how technology, how innovations in these areas as part of the market revolution affected segments of American society. We're going to continue this idea through our next lessons, but thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe.